The key turned in the lock with a heavy metallic click that echoed in the marrow of my bones. Before the door even swung open, the scent hit me: sandalwood, cold air, and expensive ambition. It was a sensory trigger that bypassed logic and went straight to the nervous system. Standing in the center of the room, framed by the fluorescent hallway light and surrounded by half-unpacked boxes, was Sloane. The ghost of my high school trauma wasn't just haunting the hallway. She was claiming the bottom bunk. The heavy fire door clicked shut behind me, sealing the airlock. The room was a study in enforced intimacy, a standard double, the housing brochure had called it. In reality, it was a cinder block cage designed to dissolve boundaries. 12 feet by 12 feet. That was the math of my coming year. I stood frozen by the door, my duffel bag a heavy anchor in my hand, watching Sloane colonize the space. She moved with a terrifying, clinical precision. There was no hesitation, no awkward fumble of a girl confronting her victim. She simply lifted a stack of charcoal sweaters and placed them into the narrow dresser drawer, aligning the edges with a geometry that felt like a threat. The irony wasn't lost on me, even in that moment of paralysis. We were both here for the psychology program, two students of human behavior trapped in a living experiment of repression and unresolved conflict. We were supposed to be learning about defense mechanisms, about the subconscious drivers of aggression, and yet here we were, acting out a silent play that Freud would have found exhausting. Sloane didn't speak. She didn't say, "I'm sorry," or "This is awkward," or "I thought you went to state." She just continued her curation of the space, her back to me, the line of her spine stiff and unyielding. I finally moved, dropping my bag on the unmade mattress of the remaining bed. The sound was a gunshot in the vacuum of the room. Sloane continued folding a silk scarf, her fingers smoothing the fabric with a reverence she had never shown a living person. The air grew heavy, dense, with 3 years of high school hallways, of whispered rumors, of the way she used to look at me, like I was a stain on her perfect world. Now, that gaze was averted, focused entirely on the task of organizing her life, as if by arranging her pens in height order she could structure the chaos of our sudden proximity. And the proximity was absolute. That was the true horror of the architecture. Our beds were separated by a scant 3 feet of linoleum, a single stride. If I stretched my arm out, I could touch her pillow. If she turned in her sleep, she would be facing me. The intimacy of it felt obscene. I began to unpack, my movements jerky and loud compared to her fluid grace. I shoved books onto the shelf. I threw my sheets onto the bed. I was trying to make noise, to assert my existence in a room she had already mentally annexed. But the air remained charged, heavy with the things we weren't saying. The territory war began without a single declaration. She placed a bottle of water on the shared desk, precisely in the center. A border marker. I placed my laptop next to it, inches away. A challenge. We moved around each other like magnets with the same polarity, a constant repelling force keeping us from colliding, yet trapping us in the same orbit. I could smell her, familiar and sharp, but underneath it, something warmer, something human. It was disorienting. Monsters aren't supposed to smell good. They aren't supposed to have neatly folded socks or favorite mugs. As the afternoon bled into evening, the shadows in the room grew long, merging our sides of the room into one gray twilight. We didn't turn on the overhead light. We existed in the dimness, two ghosts haunting the same closet. Finally, night fell completely. The campus outside was alive with the manic energy of move-in day, shouts, music, the revving of engines. But in room 304, the silence was absolute. We got into our beds in the dark, the rustle of sheets the only communication. I lay on my back, staring at the ceiling I couldn't see, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Then I heard it, the sound that shattered the illusion of distance. I heard her breathe. It was a soft, steady rhythm, just 3 feet away. In, out, in, out. It was the sound of a living, vulnerable thing. It was terrifying. In the dark, stripped of her defenses and her entourage, she was just a girl breathing. and I was the girl listening to her, the air between us charged with a history that felt less like a wall and more like a live wire, waiting for the slightest touch to spark. The war was silent, fought in inches and shelf space. The mini-fridge became a contested border zone where diplomacy went to die. I claimed the top shelf, fortifying it with oat milk and hummus containers that acted as a barricade. Sloane annexed the door and the crisper, filling them with sparkling water and dark chocolate, aligning the bottles with a military precision that mocked my chaotic stack of Tupperware. It was petty, ridiculous, and entirely consuming. We developed a silent, rigid choreography for the bathroom schedule to avoid collision. I woke at 6 to shower, ensuring I was gone before her alarm bleated. She took the evenings, filling the small, humid space with steam and the scent of eucalyptus that seeped under the door and settled into my pores. Her presence lingered on the doorframe, invaded the fibers of the shared rug, and clung to the air long after she had left. Living with an enemy means you memorize their rhythms, not out of love, but out of a primal instinct for survival. I knew the specific cadence of her typing, a rapid-fire assault on the keys. I knew the sound of her key in the lock, a sharp double click that made my stomach tighten every single time. But the fear was mutating. It was becoming something heavier, warmer, and far more confusing. One Tuesday, the dynamic finally cracked. I was studying at the desk, my back turned to the room, burying myself in a textbook to avoid acknowledging her presence. Sloane came in from a run, bringing the smell of rain and exertion with her. Usually, she would retreat to the bathroom to change, maintaining the fragile truce of our modesty. This time, she didn't. The sounds were distinct. The heavy drop of sneakers hitting the linoleum, the rustle of synthetic fabric being peeled away. I kept my eyes glued to the page, reading the same sentence about cognitive dissonance 3 times without comprehending a word. Then, the room went perfectly still. I felt the weight of her attention on the back of my neck, a physical pressure. I turned. She was standing in the center of the room, stripped down to a sports bra and running shorts, drinking from her water bottle. She stood her ground, unbothered by the intrusion. She lowered the bottle, a single drop of water tracing a slow, deliberate line down her throat, and held my gaze. It was the same look she used to give me in the cafeteria, unflinching, direct. But the context had shifted the meaning entirely. It wasn't a threat of violence anymore, it was a challenge. "You're staring," she said. Her voice was low, raspy from the run. It wasn't an accusation. It was a clinical observation. I wasn't, I lied, my voice thin and betraying me. "You were," she countered, stepping closer. The air between us thickened, charged with the heat radiating off her skin. She reached past me to grab a pen from the desk. Her arm brushed my shoulder. A deliberate, searing contact that sent a shockwave through my nervous system. "It's okay, Ayla. I don't mind." The use of my name was a shock. In high school, she only used it as a punchline. Now it rolled off her tongue with a casual, terrifying familiarity. She walked away, grabbing her shower caddy, leaving me paralyzed in the chair. My heart wasn't pounding from fear. That was the terrible realization. My hands were shaking. My skin, where she touched me, felt branded, and the feeling in my chest was a dark, heavy pull. I tried to rationalize it. It was Stockholm Syndrome. It was mere proximity. But the body doesn't lie. I found myself tracking her movements with a hunger that shamed me. I watched her apply mascara in the small mirror, her mouth slightly open, focused and vulnerable. The dominance she exerted wasn't about making me feel small anymore. It was about making me feel seen, and that was infinitely more dangerous. Every time our eyes met, she held the contact a second too long, a silent acknowledgement of the tension coiling in the room. She knew. She knew I was watching, and she was performing for an audience of one. The room became too small to contain it. We carried this volatile energy out the door with us, dragging the invisible tether of our dorm room drama into the harsh, fluorescent light of the academic buildings. The university library stacks at midnight. We're a study in isolation. We had gravitated to the deepest corner of the basement, the section housing dusty periodicals that hadn't been touched since the 90s. The air circulation system hummed with a low, drowsy vibration, and the smell of decaying paper was thick enough to coat the back of my throat. We sat at one of the heavy oak tables, scarred by generations of bored students carving initials into the varnish. Sloane was across from me, and the atmosphere was so charged it felt like the air pressure had dropped before a storm. She was reading a case study on repression. I was staring at the same paragraph of civilization and its discontents for the 20th time. The words swam. The inclination to aggression is an original, self-subsisting, instinctual disposition in man. Freud was mocking me. I couldn't focus because Sloane was dismantling my concentration with surgical efficiency. She had a pen in her mouth, a blue ballpoint. She was biting down on the cap, her teeth grazing the plastic with a subtle, rhythmic click. It was an unconscious habit, or maybe it was entirely conscious. With Sloane, the line between habit and strategy was always blurred. I watched the movement of her jaw, the way her eyes narrowed as she highlighted a passage. She looked severe, intellectual, and devastating. The table was wide, but not wide enough to sever the connection. Underneath the wooden surface, in the shadow of the table legs, a separate conversation was taking place. It started as an accident, a shift of posture. The toe of her sneaker bumped against my shin. In high school, I would have flinched. I would have pulled my legs back, tucking them under my chair to make myself smaller. Tonight, I didn't move. I held my ground. A second later, she moved again. This time, it wasn't a bump. It was a press. The sole of her shoe rested against my calf, a solid, deliberate weight. I looked up. She didn't look up from her book. She turned a page, the paper rasping loudly in the quiet. I pushed back. I applied pressure against her foot with my own leg. It was a challenge, a petty physical argument carried out in the dark under a library table. "Move," my leg said. "Make me," hers replied. The aggression was familiar. This was the language we knew. Force and resistance. But then the dialect shifted. The pressure of her foot softened. It stopped being a shove and became a slide. Her sneaker dragged slowly up the side of my calf, the friction audible only to me, a rasp of canvas against denim. The air in the stacks changed. It went from stale to electric. The intellectual posturing of our textbooks was forgotten. My heart was beating in my throat, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She wasn't fighting me for space anymore. She was exploring the territory. Her foot reached my knee, hooking slightly around the back of my leg. It was possessive. It was a claim. I stopped breathing. I looked at her face, searching for a sign, a smirk, a cruelty. There was none. She was staring at her notes, but her pupils were blown wide, black holes swallowing the iris. She was reading the same line over and over again. I could tell because her eyes weren't moving. Emboldened by the silence, or perhaps driven mad by it, I did something reckless. I let my right hand drop from the tabletop. I let it hang in the space between us. It was an offering, a question. Sloane didn't hesitate. Her hand, which had been resting on her knee, drifted forward. Her fingers brushed against mine. It wasn't a hold. It was a graze. The pads of her fingers traced the back of my hand, ghosting over the knuckles. Her skin was cool, dry. My skin burned. The contrast was dizzying. For a moment, we were suspended there, her foot hooked behind my knee, her fingers teasing mine in the dark under the table, while, above the surface, we were just two roommates studying for a midterm. The duality was exhausting. It was a high-wire act with no net. Suddenly, the motion sensor timer ran out. The lights in our aisle clicked off, plunging us into sudden darkness. The blackness broke the trance. We both jerked back, retracting our limbs. The sound of chairs scraping against the floor was violent. I fumbled for my phone, the flashlight beam cutting a jagged slice through the dark. It illuminated Sloane's face. She looked wrecked. Her composure was gone, replaced by a flushed, wild look that mirrored my own internal chaos. She stood up abruptly, gathering her books with shaking hands. "I can't study here," she said. Her voice was tight, a wire pulled to the breaking point. She walked away fast, heading for the main reading room, where the lights never went out. I stayed in the dark, listening to the sound of her footsteps retreating. The silence of the library rushed back in to fill the space she left, but it felt louder than shouting. The basement laundry room at 2 a.m. was a sensory deprivation tank in reverse, an overload of heat, noise, and humidity that felt detached from the world above. It was a concrete bunker, filled with the rhythmic thrum of 20 industrial machines, a mechanical heartbeat that vibrated through the floorboards and up into the soles of my shoes. The air was thick enough to chew, tasting of synthetic lavender and ozone, a cloying sweetness coating the back of my throat. I was alone, or so I thought, transferring wet clothes to the dryer, my movements automatic, my mind still looped on the friction of her foot against my leg in the library. Then, the heavy steel door creaked open and clicked shut. The pressure in the room shifted instantly. I didn't need to turn around to know it was her. The air charged, the static electricity of the dryers seemingly leaping to arc between us. Sloane didn't have a laundry basket. She didn't have detergent. She had simply followed the pull. She walked down the center aisle, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, reflecting off the damp sheen of the concrete floor. She stopped at the end of the row, leaning back against a tumbling dryer, her arms crossed, watching me work. The machine vibrated against her spine, a constant, aggressive shudder, but she looked perfectly still. "You're up late," she said. Her voice cut through the white noise, low and pitched perfectly to reach me. "I couldn't sleep," I replied, not looking at her, shoving a tangle of wet denim into the drum. "Me neither." The aisle between the bank of dryers and the folding tables was narrow, a claustrophobic channel designed for utility, not confrontation. I had to pass her to get to the detergent dispenser. It was a calculated risk. I picked up my empty basket and moved toward her. She didn't step back. She didn't press herself against the machine to make room. She occupied the space with terrifying confidence, forcing me to navigate the inches between her body and the table. I tried to slide past, turning my body sideways. It was a mistake, bringing us face to face. My hip brushed hers, a solid, unyielding contact that sent a jolt of heat straight to my stomach. I froze. The dryer behind her clicked into its spin cycle, the revving motor screaming as the drum picked up speed. The floor shook. The air between us was sultry, heavy with moisture and intent. Sloane shifted her weight, effectively trapping me against the laminate edge of the folding table. It wasn't a threat of violence. It was an assessment. She looked down at me, her eyes dark, scanning my face with a clinical curiosity that felt invasive. She reached out, her hand diving into my laundry basket, which sat on the table behind me. I gasped, a sharp intake of breath lost in the roar of the machines. Her hand came up holding a piece of black lace, something delicate and sheer that I had buried at the bottom of the load. "I didn't know you owned things like this," she murmured, the fabric draped over her calloused fingers. She rubbed the lace between her thumb and forefinger, a tactile study of texture. "In high school, you were all cotton and caution. You wore those gray t-shirts like armor." "Give that back," I whispered, but I didn't reach for it. My hands were gripping the edge of the table, knuckles white. "I used to hate how much you tried to hide," she continued, her voice dropping, vibrating in my chest along with the machines. "It drove me crazy. I wanted to rip the layers off you just to see if there was anything real underneath." The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The bullying, the locker room taunts, the way she used to snap my bra strap or knock my books from my hands. It hadn't been discussed. It had been a violent, confused obsession. She hadn't wanted to destroy me. She had wanted to consume me, and she hadn't possessed the vocabulary to know the difference. The cruelty was just desire curdled by fear. "Sloane," I said, the name tasting like ash and sugar. She stepped closer, her thigh pressing firmly between mine, pinning me against the table. The heat was suffocating. "You're not hiding anymore, Ela, are you?" She dropped the lace back into the basket. She didn't kiss me. She didn't have to. The proximity was the act. She held my gaze for one more second, unflinching, raw, and then stepped back. The loss of her warmth left me shivering despite the humid air. Don't shrink them, she said, turning and walking out. I stood there as the door clicked shut, the cold draft from the hallway hitting my damp skin, leaving me alone in the spin cycle. The fever didn't creep up on me. It tackled me in the dark. I woke up at 3 a.m. drowning on dry land, the air in the room feeling thick and gelatinous, resisting every attempt I made to inhale. My skin felt too tight for my body, a casing that was rapidly shrinking as the heat rose from the marrow outward. I tried to sit up, but the room tilted violently on its axis, the dark shapes of the furniture smearing into terrifying, elongated shadows. I let out a sound, a pathetic, involuntary whimper that scraped against the silence of the room. I expected silence. I expected Sloane to sleep through it, or perhaps to turn over with an annoyed sigh at my disruption of the peace. Instead, the movement from the other side of the room was instantaneous. There was no groggy transition from sleep to wakefulness. One moment, the room was still, and the next, Sloane was standing over my bed. In the dark, she loomed like a specter, but when she reached out, her hand wasn't a claw. It was a cool, solid anchor pressing against my forehead. "You're burning up," she said. Her voice was stripped of its usual mockery. It was low, serious, and terrifyingly calm. "I'm fine," I mumbled, the lie tasting like copper and cotton. I tried to push her hand away, my coordination sloppy and slow. Just hot. "You're not fine, Ella. You're vibrating." She didn't ask for permission. She didn't negotiate. She went to work. I watched through the haze of my delirium as Sloane dismantled the room and reassembled it around my sickness. She turned on the small desk lamp, keeping the light low and angled away from my eyes. She stripped the heavy duvet off my legs, her movements efficient and unsentimental, replacing it with a thin cotton sheet. She disappeared into the bathroom, the sound of running water echoing like a waterfall, and returned with a washcloth wrung out to the perfect dampness. When she pressed the cloth to my neck, I gasped. The shock of the cold against my superheated skin was so intense it bordered on pain, but then the relief washed over me, a tidal wave of mercy. Sloane sat on the edge of my bed. The boundary had been obliterated. She was in my space, her hip pressing against the mattress, her focus entirely on the rise and fall of my chest. "Drink," she commanded, holding her own water bottle to my lips. She supported the back of my head with her hand, her fingers tangling in my sweat-dampened hair. The intimacy of the gesture was shattering. This was the girl who had once knocked a tray of food out of my hands, now tilting a bottle so I wouldn't choke. I drank, the water cool and clean, grounding me back in reality. "Why?" I whispered, my voice cracking. The fever had stripped away my defenses, leaving me raw and honest. "Why are you doing this?" Sloane paused, the bottle hovering near my mouth. She looked down at me, her expression unreadable in the shadows. She took the warm cloth from my neck, walked to the sink to rinse it with cold water again, and returned. She didn't answer until she had placed it back on my forehead, smoothing the hair back from my temples with a touch that was devastatingly gentle. "Because you're helpless," she said finally. But the bite was gone from the words. "And because I know what it's like to burn and have no one notice." I looked at her, really looked at her. Her hair was messy from sleep, falling in soft waves around her face. She wasn't wearing her armor of perfect makeup or icy detachment. She was just a girl in a t-shirt, tired and worried, taking care of the person she was supposed to hate. The monster I had constructed in my head began to dissolve, replaced by this confusing, competent reality. She wasn't cruel. She was protective. She just had a terrible way of showing it when the lights were on. "I don't hate you right now," I confessed, the delirium loosening the lock on my secrets. "I think that scares me more than the fever." Sloane's hand stilled on my shoulder. She looked at me, her gaze unflinching but soft, a green sea calm after a storm. "Go to sleep, Ella," she murmured, her thumb brushing the hollow of my throat. "I'm not going anywhere." I closed my eyes. The fear that had defined our relationship, the fear of her judgment, her cruelty, her presence, evaporated into the heat. I drifted off, anchored by the weight of her hand on my shoulder and the steady rhythm of her breathing, no longer 3 feet away, but right there, guarding the dark. The fever broke just before dawn, leaving me weak and hollowed out. But the dynamic in the room had shifted permanently. The wall between us hadn't just been breached, it had been dissolved by sweat and cool water. We weren't enemies anymore. We were survivors of the same long night. The recovery from the fever left a lingering rawness, a stripped-back sensitivity that made the world feel too loud, but the social imperative of college life demanded attendance. It was Friday. We went to a house party 3 blocks off campus, a structure that vibrated with bass and smelled of cheap beer and desperation. I stood in the corner, clutching a plastic cup of lukewarm soda like a shield, watching the ecosystem of the room. Or rather, watching Sloane. She was in her element here. The dorm room Sloane, the quiet, intense scholar who brought me water in the dark, was gone. In her place was the high school queen, radiant and terrifying. She held court near the keg, laughing at something a tall guy in a varsity jacket said. He was leaning in too close, his hand resting casually on the wall behind her head, boxing her in. It was a mirror image of how she used to box me in, but the dynamic was inverted. He was the pursuer, she was the prize, and I was the spectator, dying a slow, suffocating death by jealousy. It wasn't the petty envy of high school, wishing for her popularity. This was visceral. It was a hot, twisting knot in my gut that tightened every time he touched her arm. I watched his hand, large, clumsy, uninvited, brush against the sleeve of her leather jacket. I wanted to break his fingers. The violence of the thought shocked me. I wasn't a violent person. I was the quiet girl, the observer. But seeing her smile at him, that practiced, dazzling smile that didn't reach her eyes, made me want to burn the house down. Then she looked up, across the crowded, sweaty room, through the haze of smoke and bad lighting. Her eyes found mine. It was magnetic. The laughter on her face died instantly. She saw the jealousy. She didn't look triumphant. She looked relieved. She murmured something to the guy, who looked confused, then annoyed, and pushed past him without a backward glance. She cut through the crowd like a shark through water, coming straight for me. "We're leaving," she said. It wasn't a question. "You looked busy," I snapped, the words bitter on my tongue. "I was bored. Let's go." She grabbed my wrist, her grip firm and grounding, and towed me out the back door. The cool night air hit us like a slap, clearing the fog of the party. The silence of the suburban street was jarring after the noise inside. We walked side by side, the distance between us fluctuating. 2 feet, 1 foot, brushing shoulders. The click of our boots on the pavement was the only sound in the sleeping neighborhood. "You didn't have to leave," I said, breaking the silence. My voice sounded thin in the cold air. "He seemed nice." "He was an idiot," Sloane said, staring straight ahead. "And you looked like you were about to throw up or scream." "I was fine." "You were jealous. Ella." The truth hung there, naked and shivering. I stopped walking. "Don't do that. Don't analyze me." "I'm not analyzing you. I'm reading the room. You were glaring at him like he was a contagion." "Maybe I just don't like seeing you pretend," I shot back, the anger flaring hot and fast. "Pretending to be charmed, pretending to be normal. It's exhausting to watch." Sloane stopped. She turned slowly, her face illuminated by a flickering street lamp. "And what am I supposed to be? The monster? Is that the only role you let me play?" "It's the only one I understand," I shouted, the volume startling us both. "Because this," I gestured between us, "this caring roommate act, the fever, the library, it's confusing, Sloane. It makes me want things I shouldn't want. And I hate it." The confession hung in the air, heavy and irrevocable. Sloane moved. It was a blur of motion. She closed the distance between us in a single stride, backing me up until my shoulders hit the rough brick of a garden wall. She didn't slam me, she pressed me, her hands planted on the brick on either side of my head, caging me in. But this time, unlike high school, she wasn't looming to intimidate. She was leaning in to surrender. Her chest was heaving, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts that mingled with mine in the cold air. Her eyes were searching my face, frantic and wide. "You think you're the only one who's confused?" she whispered, the sound torn from her throat. "You think I wanted this? To be stuck in a room with the one person who saw through me? It would be so much easier if I could just hate you. Then why don't you? I breathed, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I don't know how to be around you, she said, her voice breaking. Without breaking something. The space between us vanished. The anger drained away, replaced by a terrifying, gravity-defying pull. We were standing on the precipice of something irreversible. For a long, agonizing moment, she just stared at me, her gaze tracing the line of my jaw, her lips parted as if she were about to speak or scream or devour me. Then she dropped her head, her forehead resting against my shoulder. A surrender. "Let's go home," she murmured into my coat. She pulled away, the loss of her heat, immediate and painful. We walked the rest of the way to the dorm, in a silence that was no longer empty. It was heavy, vibrating with the things we had almost done, the lines we had almost crossed. The air wasn't just cold anymore. It was charged, waiting for the spark that would finally burn the house down. The door clicked shut, sealing us back into our 12 by 12 universe, but the airlock had failed. The pressure inside was equal to the pressure outside now. I didn't turn on the overhead light. I left us in the amber glow of the street lamps filtering through the blinds, striping the room in bars of light and shadow like a noir film. Sloane didn't retreat to her territory. She stood in the center of the room, the demilitarized zone, stripping off her leather jacket with jerky, frustrated movements. She threw it onto her desk, sending a stack of carefully aligned papers sliding across the wood. She didn't fix them. That was the first sign that the world as we knew it had ended. "Say it," I whispered. My back was pressed against the door, my hand still gripping the cold metal of the handle, anchoring myself. "You started it outside. Finish it." Sloane turned to face me. In the half-light, her eyes were dark pools, unreadable and vast. She looked wrecked, her chest rising and falling as if she'd run a marathon. "You want the truth, Ela? The clinical diagnosis?" She took a step toward me, invading my personal space again, but this time I didn't flinch. I rooted my feet to the floor. "I want to know why," I said, my voice steady. "Why you made my life hell for 3 years. Why you're looking at me right now like I'm the one holding the knife." "Because you were," she said, her voice dropping to a rough whisper that scraped against the silence. "You always were." She stopped a foot away from me. The scent of her, the sandalwood, the cold night air, the faint, metallic tang of adrenaline filled my lungs. It was intoxicating. "I was a mess in high school," she began, the words tumbling out fast, driven by a desperate need to purge the poison. "My house was a war zone. My dad drank until he was mean, and my mom just disappeared into the wallpaper. I had no control over anything, except school. I built that kingdom because I needed to be untouchable. If I was the shark, no one would notice I was bleeding." She paused, running a hand through her hair, destroying the perfect waves. "And then there was you. You were quiet. You were self-contained. You sat in the back of the class and read books I couldn't understand, and you didn't care about the hierarchy. You existed outside of it. You looked at me with this indifference. It drove me insane." "So you punished me for it?" "No," she shook her head, a sharp, violent motion. "I punished you because I couldn't stop watching you. I'd see you in the library or walking home, and my stomach would drop. I felt this pull, this terrifying gravity. I didn't know what it was. I just knew it made me feel weak. And I couldn't be weak. So I attacked. I thought if I broke you, if I made you small, the feeling would go away. I thought if I made you hate me, I could stop wanting you." The confession hung in the air, raw and ugly and beautiful. "I wanted you," she said, the words landing like stones in deep water. "So I tried to break you because I couldn't have you. It was twisted, and it was cruel, and I am sorry. I am so sorry, Ela." It wasn't a plea for forgiveness. It was an admission of defeat. She stood there, stripped of her armor, waiting for the verdict. And in that moment, the power dynamic that had defined us for years finally inverted. I wasn't the victim. I was the obsession. The fear I had carried The belief that I was worthless in her eyes dissolved into ash. I stepped away from the door. I crossed the invisible line in the center of the room. "You didn't break me," I said softly. "I know," she breathed. "You're the strongest person I know." "And you," I said, reaching out. My hand trembled slightly as I touched her face, my fingers tracing the sharp line of her jaw. Her skin burned under my touch. "You're not a shark, Sloane. You're just a girl who's afraid of the dark." She leaned into my touch, her eyes fluttering shut, a ragged exhale escaping her lips. "Terrified," she admitted. The distance was gone. The 3 feet between the beds, the 3 years of history, the walls we had built, all of it collapsed. I stepped in. I closed the gap. My other hand found her waist, pulling her flesh against me. The contact was electric, a shock that jumped from her body to mine, fusing us together. "Show me," I whispered, the command feeling foreign and right in my mouth. "Show me what you wanted." Sloane's eyes snapped open. The hesitation vanished. Her hands came up to grip my shoulders, her fingers digging in, grounding herself. "Ela," she warned, a last gasp of restraint. "Show me," I repeated. She surrendered. She lowered her head and kissed me. It wasn't tentative. It wasn't gentle. It was an avalanche. It was 3 years of repressed hunger and misdirected rage channeled into a single point of contact. Her mouth was hot, demanding, desperate. She tasted of mint and the cheap beer from the party and something entirely her own. I kissed her back with equal force, my hands tangling in her hair, pulling her closer, trying to erase the space between our atoms. We stumbled back, a clumsy, frantic tangle of limbs, until the back of my knees hit her mattress. We went down together, the springs creaking in protest, the sound lost in the rush of blood in my ears. The past didn't matter. The high school hallways were a million miles away. There was only this room, this bed, and the girl who had haunted my nightmares, finally becoming the dream. The war ended, but the intensity didn't fade. It simply changed frequency. We didn't sleep much that first night. The narrow twin mattress designed for a single student became a raft we refused to leave. In the dark, the silence that had once been a weapon became a sanctuary. Sloane's precision, the trait I had feared most, the way she could dismantle my confidence with a single look, transformed into something devastatingly intimate. She approached my body with the same rigorous focus she applied to her studies. She wasn't tentative, she mapped me. She learned the exact pressure required to make my breath hitch, the specific angle of a touch that turned a shiver into a gasp. It was a new kind of curriculum, a syllabus written entirely on skin. The bullying had been about control, about imposing her will on my reality to silence her own noise. This was different. This was collaboration. "Tell me," she would whisper against the pulse point of my neck, her hands steady, calloused, and impossibly warm. "Tell me if this is okay." The monster I had constructed was gone, replaced by a girl who treated my pleasure like a high-stakes project she refused to fail. The cruelty was just energy, and energy can be converted. The heat was the same, only the intent had shifted. It was bold, explicit, and overwhelming. She touched me with a possessiveness that felt less like ownership and more like worship, undoing the damage of 3 years with the meticulous care of an archivist restoring a damaged manuscript. Morning brought a harsh gray light filtering through the blinds, illuminating the wreckage of our territory war. Clothes were scattered across the floor, crossing the invisible borderline we had maintained for months. I woke, up with a cramp in my shoulder and Sloane's arm heavy across my waist. We were tangled together in a space meant for one, limbs braided in a knot that defied physics. In high school, being this close to her would have induced a panic attack. Now, the sharp discomfort of the springs digging into my hip felt like a luxury. It was physical proof of her presence. Sloane woke up slowly. She didn't jump up to fix her hair or reassemble her armor. She blinked open those green eyes, saw me watching her, and didn't look away. There was no flinching, no morning after regret. She just tightened her grip on me, pulling me closer into the warmth of her chest, burying her face in my hair. "We're going to be late for Iris's lecture," she murmured, her voice rough with sleep, the vibration humming against my ribs. I don't care, I answered. And I didn't. The academic observation was over. We were the case study now. The days that followed established a new rhythm. The silence in the room was no longer a vacuum. It was companionable. The fridge war ended with a peace treaty involving shared oat milk and her dark chocolate. The bathroom schedule dissolved into shared showers where the steam wasn't a barrier, but a veil for quiet moments of closeness. The scent of her eucalyptus soap finally becoming ours. We didn't pretend the past didn't exist. We couldn't. It was the foundation we were building on. Every time she looked at me with that intense, focused gaze, I remembered the hallway taunts, but I also remembered the confession in the dark. The scar tissue made the skin tougher, but it also made it more sensitive. We weren't fixing what was broken. We were building something entirely new out of the debris, realizing that the jagged edges of our history were the only things that allowed us to fit together so perfectly. The proximity was no longer forced by a housing lottery or a cruel twist of fate. It was a choice we made every time we walked back into room 304 and locked the door behind us. The sun is fully up now, casting stripes across the desk, where 2 coffee cups sit side by side, touching. The room is messy, the bed is unmade, and for the first time in my life, everything is exactly where it belongs. We took the long way here, through a minefield of our own making, but we arrived. If you've ever found love in the wreckage of your past, subscribe for more stories.